If you would like to participate in our post survey, please put your email address in the chat and I will send it to you. Also, if you notice the chat box, I did add a PDF called Scope Worksheet. So I'm going to try a little something different this year for 2026. A lot of my trainings have just kind of been sporadic, just kind of ideas that I've had, ideas that you've given me. But this year I am separating them into themes. And I'm going to try to give you all additional material for reflection purposes and things like that. So, of course, it's not mandatory. None of this is. But if you're interested in the worksheet, you should just be able to click on it and download it. And then you can just use that as you want to, okay? And I'll explain it a little bit more as we go along. So today we're going to talk about caregiving as a job and role creep, okay? Because I think oftentimes we get into caregiving and we don't realize how much we're actually doing. And so then when we're tired, when we're depleted, when we're frustrated, when we're anxious, we wonder, what's wrong with me? Okay. And oftentimes there is nothing wrong with you, right? You're just doing something really hard, sometimes annoying, sometimes scary, and without a lot of pre-planning or there's no manual or guidebook, right? There's no onboarding, but it is definitely a job. So I want to kind of clarify that with you today, and hopefully it'll be enough to where you can give yourself permission to not beat yourself up. Okay. All right. So this is really about understanding the role, the job you've stepped into, and why over time it can start to feel heavier than you had anticipated. Okay. A lot of our caregiving happens informally, excuse me, almost casually, and then slowly turns into something very complex and demanding. And so we're going to look at why that happens, and how to understand the scope and limits and how that can reduce that strain that you may be carrying. So, caregiving involves labor, responsibility, coordination, decision making, okay? And when we don't name that clearly, we have a harder time delegating or taking things off our plate, maybe prioritizing, right? Because everything seems equal in urgency when we're in the thick of it. And so we feel like we're being pulled in all these different directions, and maybe we don't have to be, okay? So this is supposed to give you a little bit of clarity on what you're actually doing and give you some tools, or at least an idea on how you can start to lessen the load, okay? So, like I said before, a lot of times you feel overwhelmed or exhausted with the task at hand, and you assume that you're doing something wrong or that you're failing in some way because of it. But in my experience, most people aren't overwhelmed because of personal shortcomings. You're overwhelmed because the role itself expands over time, often without any clear boundaries or guidance or additional support. So as the needs of your loved one increase, your support typically doesn't. So, we don't get a job description. There's no onboarding. There's really no clear conversations usually about limits, about what authority you have, or expectations, especially when you think about extended family or people who aren't the primary caregiver. They just assume you've got it, right? Or if a shift has to happen, they assume you're the one that's shifting, right? And too often I've spoken with caregivers and you will say, I'm fine, I've got it. I'm fine, I've got it. And you do, but it shouldn't have to be so hard, right? And so it's hard to speak your needs, especially if you're afraid they're not going to be met, right? So my goal is to help you understand this as a job and help you kind of move out of that self-blame and into that more realistic understanding of what's being asked of you, okay? And I think once you see what's being asked of you and what you do every day and the cognitive load it takes to manage the life of another person on top of your own, you'll understand very quickly, oh, this is why I feel like I'm struggling. This is why I feel like I'm drowning. Okay. So I want to offer a quiet moment of reflection. Nobody has to share, but if you would like to, feel free to type it into the chat. So when you feel overwhelmed, what story do you usually tell yourself about why you're overwhelmed? Do you think I should be handling this better? Or do you think this is a lot for one person, right? Which story kind of shows up for you? Because one is based in shame and the other is built or based in reality of capacity, right? So I'm overwhelmed because I'm not doing it good enough, or I'm overwhelmed because it's a lot, right? And the stories we tell ourselves matter because that's what we build our reality on, right? So if we feel that our overwhelm is due to a personal flaw or personal failing, we're just going to want to try harder. We're going to try to be better. We're going to try to improve, right? Fill in the gaps. But if you tell your story, this is a lot for one person, then the response is probably going to be, let me get some help, right? Then it's not about personal failing. It's not about shame. It's not about guilt. It's about capacity. Does that make sense? So for most of you, caregiving starts small, whether you're caring for someone who maybe has a cognitive decline or a new diagnosis that the symptoms and the behaviors change over time, or if you're a parent where the signs and symptoms of your child's diagnoses didn't show up until they're 5 years old or what have you. And so things shift over time, right? So it could start off as just driving someone to an appointment or picking up groceries, and then you stay a little longer for dinner, and that feels temporary, manageable, like you're just helping, right? But then one appointment becomes many. One phone call turns into ongoing coordination. One specialist refers you to another specialist, right? One resource can't help you, so now you have to go find another resource, right? And you start tracking medications, you start talking to insurance, you start managing all these schedules, right? And so that change is gradual and it's almost kind of sneaky, right? And some of you are looking at diagnoses that you're managing that aren't going to get any quote unquote better, right? It's going to continue throughout the lifespan of your loved one. And so then you have to be the one to continue throughout the lifespan of your loved one, right? And so think of it like sand filling a jar, right? A little more each day until one day you look around and think, how did all this become just mine to handle, right? Why am I the access upon which everything else is now rotating, right? So think back to when caregiving officially started for you, okay? What was the very first task you took on? And if you compare that to what you're doing now, how different is that picture? What got added that you never really consciously agreed to? And I know there are some things that you can't agree to necessarily, that's just the job and that's just what you're doing, right? And there's no one else to do it, and that's fine. But I would bet that there's probably some things that you are taking on that you don't have to take on, that somebody else could do, or maybe could be paused or not prioritized, right? Not everything you do has to be a priority. So you often will just adapt without noticing the expansion, right? Have you guys heard that adage, the boiling frog, right? Where you can put a frog in a pot of water and slowly raise the temperature, and they won't even notice they're being boiled alive, right? Because they're acclimating to the temperature change. And then before they know it, they're soup. How many of you all wake up one day and realize, crap, I've been soup for 5 years and I didn't even realize the heat was getting turned up, right? Maybe that's kind of a gory metaphor, but you guys know me by this point. I'm a little weird person. Okay, so role creep increases strain, okay? So as the role expands, the strain tends to follow this very predictable pattern. Tasks increase, but support does not. Your responsibilities grow, but your authority doesn't, right? So if you're co-parenting or if you're caring for a loved one and there's other siblings involved or other extended family, um, they may want to have group meetings and have input on decisions that are being made, but they're not offering to do any of the extra work, right? And so you have all these responsibilities, but you don't get the final say and you don't get the authority to manage care. It has to be a group effort, right? Which is fine, but if people aren't in it with you, they're not going to be as skilled to make those decisions as you are. And so their input might be helpful, but they shouldn't be the authority on how things go, right? Expectations rise, but nobody clearly names them. It's just when they think you're doing something wrong, then all of a sudden, well, you should be fill in the blank, right? So you often end up absorbing gaps left by family members not willing to contribute, larger systems, right? So if the medical system doesn't coordinate, guess what you do, right? If paperwork falls through, you're the one that catches it. And if something goes wrong, you're the one that figures it out. Okay. These are all cognitive loads. These are all thinking tasks that require energy. And that's why you get so tired. It's not that you're running a marathon physically all day, you're running a marathon cognitively all day, right? And then you add the stress of if I drop the ball, the whole structure collapses. Ooh, that sense of urgency is incredibly draining for your nervous system, right? So over time, you're not just helping, you're holding the whole structure together. And so this is what I mean by role creep. The job grows without anyone intentionally designing it. So you're just constantly adapting. You're constantly searching your environment for ways that you need to fill in the gaps, right? And so when you start to feel that stretched, thin feeling, or like you're constantly behind, even when you're working really, really hard, that can very easily be translated into guilt, shame, I'm lacking, right? But the strain is structural. Structural, you know what I'm trying to say. It's not about effort or love, it's about your workload. And it's just getting more intense and more involved. And there's no one there to really see it but you, right? So I want to ask you, and again, you can share in the chat or you can just think to yourself, where do you feel most stretched right now? Is it time? Is it energy? Decision making? Maybe it's the emotional load, right? I know for me as a mother with neurodivergent children, there's a lot of emotional load that I have to carry for 5 other people, right? And I'm happy to do it because I'm their mother, but I'm not going to deny that it costs me something, right? Maybe it's all the coordination, right? Maybe it's this specialist on this side of town and this specialist on the other side of town, and they want to meet 30 minutes apart. It's a 45-minute drive, right? So how do you do that? How do you do that? And then in the mix of it, your kids are whiny and they're cranky and they're overstimulated and they're hungry and their socks weird on their foot, right? So it's a lot. It's a lot. So if you had to name the heaviest part of this job, what would it be? Uncertainty of the future? That stretching landscape of this is never going to end and I'm always going to feel tired and I'm always going to be depleted? That can be heavy. It is heavy. It's not a personal failing on your end. That's the job, right? But if we don't see it as a job, we can very much see it as I'm not doing enough. When in reality, you're probably doing more than any one person can handle long term. Okay. So limits are structural, not moral. Okay. So one of the most important ideas I want you to leave with today is this truth. Okay. Limits aren't a sign that you don't care enough. They're a sign that you're human. Surprise. You're a human. You have limits, right? Limits protect the sustainability of the job. Okay. Every role has capacity and every person has energy that runs out. That is biology. That's not character. Okay. Think of it this way. If a paid job quietly doubled in hours and responsibility, we would call that unsustainable, right? We wouldn't call the employee selfish for struggling with that. And caregiving is no different, okay? Limits protect our longevity. They're what make it possible to keep showing up day after day after day, right? And having limits, setting boundaries, taking things off your plate, that is not you failing at the job. That is you learning the choreography mid-dance, right? It takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of skill, and you should be proud of yourself for managing it the way that you have so far, right? If someone you loved were doing everything that you're doing, would you expect them to do it without any limits? What would you want for them? Can you offer even just a small piece of that same compassion to yourself? So to make this more concrete, let's look at some everyday examples, okay? So maybe you started helping with meals and now you're managing 5 medical appointments every month, right? That's a bit much, right? Maybe you've become the default decision maker for the whole family, even though no one officially asks you to take that on. It was just kind of expected, right? Well, that's what moms do. That's what dads do. That's what spouses do. That's what daughters and sons do, right? Maybe you're coordinating between doctors, pharmacy, home health, insurance, repeating the same story over and over and over again, like a one-person call center, right? That gets annoying, that gets old, it gets irritating, right? And they don't happen because you necessarily volunteered for a bigger job. It just happened because somebody had to do it and you care, right? So if this sounds familiar, you are in very good company. This is not an isolated tale, okay? This is the reality for so many millions of people across the globe. So what can we actually do with all this information? Now that I've validated you and I've surrounded you in a nice little bubble of love and acceptance, what are you going to do with it, okay? Well, the first step to making change is acknowledge what it is you're actually dealing with, right? We can't change what we don't understand. So the first step is visibility, okay? So the PDF that I put in the chat, and I'm more than happy to email that out with the survey if you're interested, is a worksheet you can fill out to kind of list all the things that you do in a typical week, okay? Not just the big tasks, like everything, right? The calls, the constant reminders, the driving, the paperwork, emotional support. When we see things on paper, it can really be very, very powerful. It can be very empowering because it kind of turns this vague sense of I'm doing a lot into something concrete. And then you can see, oh, holy cannoli, I really am doing a lot, right? And then I want you to notice on the PDF what was added unintentionally, the ones that just kind of stuck to you, right? That you have to do. I know over the holidays, we had talked a little bit about how even if you're in the trenches of caregiving, some of you were still expected to perform holidays. You're still expected to perform Christmas and prepare Thanksgiving amongst all the chaos of your every day-to-day life, right? Because people don't get it. They don't understand that you're already buckling at the knees under the weight of all that you're already doing. They just assume, well, they've got it. They've always done it. What's the big deal this year, right? Well, the big deal is maybe mom had a fall, was in rehab for 6 months, and now everything's discombobulated, right? Or maybe somebody lost their job because they had to go full time into caregiving, and so they can't have, you know, the extra resources to provide all the glitz and the glamour of Christmas, right? But people don't see that. They just think, well, they've got it. They've always gotten it, right? So notice those tasks. What were just kind of given to me, I didn't actually agree to. And so from there, you can start asking, well, which ones of these are essential, right? Non-negotiables that have to happen. What can be shared or delegated or even done differently? I think some of the hardest realities we have to come to is that we have to drop our standards sometimes in some areas because the way we would like things to be done and the way that we have capacity to do them can be vastly different, right? I kind of joke with each child, my standards of cleanliness dropped just for my sanity's sake, right? And that's not a moral failing. That's me understanding the capacity I have as a single person, right? So when it's safe and appropriate, after you've kind of gotten all this stuff down, have a clear conversation with those in your circle about expectations, right? This can make a big difference because unspoken roles tend to grow, right? But spoken roles can be negotiated, okay? I know the isolation component is huge, right? Well, I'd like to do these things, but mom can't leave the house anymore, right? I'd love to do these things, but little Johnny, that environment's just too sensory for him and he freaks out and can't be in those spaces with the other kids, right? And so you isolate to manage the care. Well, what if you were delegating some of these things? Maybe Johnny can't go to the trampoline park, but his sister Sally can go. So maybe, Auntie can take Sally, right? Conversations about roles and expectations, you may be surprised. People are willing to help, but sometimes they just don't know how. And you don't know how to have them help either because you never sat and thought about it. So this is an invitation for you to sit and think about it, okay? And also to give yourself permission to accept that help because you're struggling, remember, is not about you morally failing or being weak or incapable. It's about role creep, responsibilities being stacked over time, right? So maybe you're more likely to ask for help when you realize that you don't need it because you suck, right? You need it because you're human. So here's some takeaways for you. I know this was short and sweet, but I really want you to, I really want to have time to go over that PDF with you and have a conversation, okay? So I want you to carry this with you. Caregiving roles naturally expand, and that expansion is heavy, okay? Much of the strain comes from those unclear scopes, right? Not because you're failing as a person or as a caregiver or as somebody who loves your loved one, okay? Our limits support longevity. They are not abandonment, okay? They help you stay in the work without losing yourself, which is very, very important. And when we're aware, we get choice, right? Even small adjustments can change the shape of the load you're carrying. So let me go ahead and stop my share and the recording.